Hello, boys and girls of all ages. I want to invite you to another of our lessons on prophets of God or messengers of God. And we've talked about Moses and Joseph and Samuel. And today we have another special prophet. But before we talk about this special messenger of God, this prophet of God, I need to do a little background story for you. And I brought some special pictures with me. And I don't know if you can see this very well, but at the top it says St. John's Episcopal Church, Mount Vernon, Indiana. And our church building, our current church building, was built in 1892. So that was way over like 130 years ago or so. Well, about 30 years ago, there was a group of people in the church who said, well, our church is getting pretty old. Maybe we ought to consider building a new church. So they hired a company, and this is what's called a blueprint, and it's the design of what a new church would look like on this same site. But as it turned out, they decided that they liked the current church and that they would just do some repairs to it and they would keep it. But then several years ago, here's another picture, another blueprint where there was going to be possible changes to the church. And so another blueprint was done up, and these haven't been done yet. But I just wanted to show you these two because these are drawings or plans for a house of worship or a house for God. And that is part of what our story is going to be about today, is a prophet and a king who thought about building a house for God. And just a reminder, here's what our current church looks like, St. John's Episcopal Church in Mount Vernon, Indiana. And we call this a house of worship or a house of God, a place where we come and we worship God and we believe with all our heart that God is with us when we're in this church building. Back in the time when Moses led the people out of Egypt, out of slavery in Egypt, and we already talked about that, God said, I want you to take the people from Egypt and I want you to lead them to a certain mountain that I will show you. And so when they got to this mountain, God told Moses to come up to the top of the mountain. And most of what we know is when Moses was up on the top of the mountain with God, that God gave Moses the 2 tablets that we know as the 10 Commandments. 5 commandments on one tablet and 5 on the other. 5 plus 5 is 10. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. 10 Commandments. But that's not the only thing that God talked about with Moses when he was up on the mountain. God spent a lot of time giving Moses blueprints or instructions on how to build a place for the people to worship God, a house of God. Although it was not a house made of brick necessarily, it was a tent that could be taken down and moved. And so every time that they moved around in the wilderness until they got to the promised land, then they would set this up and they would worship God in it. And it looked something like this, that it had an outer tent to it and a place where they sacrificed animals to God and give fruits to God. And then God resided in this little tent right here. That was kind of like the temple. And another fancy word is called tabernacle or dwelling. And of course, we call that house. So let's keep that in mind. So the whole time that the Israelites were wandering around in the wilderness, they worshiped God in this tent of God. Well, it turns out that they finally made it to the promised land, and once they crossed over into this promised land, the land that God had promised to Abraham and to Isaac and Jacob and their descendants forever and ever, that they still worshipped in this tent. So, to get to today's story, and there's still more of it, we're going to use this green background again because we're still in the promised land. The land that God said would be green and fertile and have wonderful fruits and vegetables, a land flowing with milk and honey. Well, so when they crossed over into this land, they had this tent, this tabernacle, this house for God, this tent for God. And in our last story, we talked about a young boy whose name was Samuel. And Samuel went to live in the temple or the tabernacle with the priest Eli. And Eli taught Samuel everything he needed to know about being a prophet and about being a priest. Well, eventually, Samuel grew up and he became a man. So here is the prophet Samuel as a man. Well, the people of Israel, they didn't want to have like judges over them. They wanted to have a king like all the other kings. So God said to Samuel, I want you to go and I want you to find a man whose name is Saul, and I want you to make Saul king. So that's what Samuel did. He went and he found a man named Saul, and he anointed him and made him king over Israel. Well, God wasn't very happy with Saul because Saul didn't always obey God and do what God wanted. So God said, well, I'm not happy with Saul being king. So Samuel, I want you to go to the house of Jesse. And Jesse has 8 sons, and I want you to anoint one of his sons as a new king over Israel. So Samuel goes to the house of Jesse, where Jesse lives, and Jesse, all of his children were shepherds, but they also fought with Saul in battles. And so one by one, all of the sons of Jesse were brought before Samuel, but Samuel said, I can't, God's not showing me who the son is that I'm supposed to anoint as king. And he says, do you have another son? And Jesse says, well, yeah, but he's the youngest and he's out tending the sheep out in the pastures. And Samuel says, well, you need to go get him right now. So he goes out and they find the boy, and his name is David. And God says, this is who I want to be king. So Samuel anoints David as king. But Saul continues to live and be king, but eventually Saul dies, and then David becomes king of Israel. So that's another part of the story. So David, though, he conquers Jerusalem, and he makes that his city, the city of David. And Jerusalem is the capital of Jerusalem even to this day. But even though David was sitting on a throne in his palace, God was still living in this tent. And David felt really bad about that. So David summoned the prophet whose name was Nathan. Nathan is our prophet today. And so David says to Nathan, I feel very badly that I am in this wonderful palace and sitting on this throne, and yet God is still hanging out and living, dwelling in this tent. And so I want to build a wonderful new house of worship and a house for God. And so Nathan says, do what feels right in your heart, because I'm sure that God will think it is a wonderful idea. So Nathan goes off, and he's doing his prophet thing and his priestly thing. But a message comes to Nathan from God and says, I want you to go and give a message to David. So Nathan goes back to David and says, God has given me a message. God doesn't want you to build him a house, that he has been quite comfortable living in his tent, and he hasn't asked for a house to be built. But he would eventually like to have a house built, but he doesn't want King David to build the house. That he says, though, that he will make David a great king, and David will have many sons, and one of his sons will replace him on the throne, and it will be that new king, David's son, who will build a house for God. And so David praised God, and God said to David, and Nathaniel told him, the prophet, that God would build David a house that would last forever. That David would have a house that would last forever. And that there would always be a son of David who would be king over Israel forever. So let's keep that in mind. So then eventually, when David dies, he has a son, and that son builds a temple in Jerusalem. And this is a wonderful temple with bricks, and it's made out of cedar wood, and that is a special wood. It smells wonderful. And so this new, bigger house of God is even more grand and more wonderful than the tent. So God moves his glory from the tent into this temple. And but God said that there would be a temple forever. Well, this temple that's made of wood and of stone, well, it was destroyed several times and rebuilt. And right now in Jerusalem and in Israel, there is no temple. So what was God talking about when he said that there would be a temple forever? I wonder if what he was talking about when he said that there would be a son of David who would last forever. I wonder if that son is Jesus Christ, who died on the cross for our sins and rose on Easter morning and lives forever. Because Jesus is called a son of David. Jesus' mother was descended from David, and his stepfather Joseph was also from David. So that's what I'm wondering about. And that's the story of Nathan, who was a prophet who helped David to figure out how about building a house for God, and God telling him that he would build him a house that would last forever. David wanted to build a house for God, but God wanted to build a house for David. So let's talk about some questions about the story, some I wonder questions. And I invite you after each question to pause the video and think about the questions or the answers that you might give to the questions. And remember that this is not a test, so there's not a right or wrong answer. There's no bad answer. There's no silly question or answer. So whatever comes to your mind would be wonderful. So the first question I would ask you is, I wonder if King David liked having Nathan as a prophet of God and having Nathan give him messages from God. And the next question is, the Bible says that King David had a heart for God. I wonder what that meant. I wonder what it means to have a heart for God. The next question is, I wonder if Nathaniel was embarrassed to have to tell David and give him the message that God didn't want him to build a temple after Nathan had already told him that it was okay to build a temple. So I wonder if Nathan was embarrassed to have to go back to David and tell him that he was wrong. I wonder if you think Nathan's message to David was a good message or a bad message. Was this a message that David wanted to hear? Or maybe it was a little of both. Maybe it was a bad message because Nathan had to tell David that he couldn't build God a house. But it was a good message in that God told David that he would build him a house. Now, King David had many sons, as I said. And I wonder which of the sons God would choose to build the temple. God told David that God would build a house for David that would last forever. I wonder, what is the oldest house that you have ever seen or have ever visited? What's the oldest house that you know about? And finally, God told David that he would give David a son who would be king forever. I wonder if that son is Jesus Christ. So think about these questions and think about how you might answer those questions. So now let us talk about maybe some crafts that we can do about this story. Well, first of all, I would invite you to think about what is the best part of the story that you like. And maybe you can draw a picture and color a picture of the part of the story that you like best. Or there are pictures on the internet, coloring pictures, that your grandparent or your parent can help you print off. And I found a picture of Nathan before King David on the throne, giving him a message from God. So maybe this is one you would like to color. I also found a picture of the tabernacle or the tent. And this kind of looks just like the picture. So maybe you could print this off and color this picture. And I also found a picture of the stone temple, the stone and the wood temple that was built by David's son in Jerusalem. And so maybe you could print this off and color it. The other thing that I would maybe invite you to do is draw your own picture of what you think a house for God would look like. Would it look like a church or like a temple? Or would it maybe look like a castle? Or maybe it would just kind of look like an ordinary house. So maybe draw a picture of what you think a house for God would look like. And another thing that you might be able to ask your parents or your grandparents to help you do is to make a gingerbread house and make a house that kind of looks like a church, and then decorate it, and then you can eat it. And wouldn't that be a wonderful thing to do, a craft that goes with this story and then be able to eat the craft? Or maybe another thing that you might want to do is take some blankets and like you would make a fort out of blankets in your house, maybe you can take those blankets and pretend that you're making a house for God or a temple for God, and then act out what it might be like for a priest or a prophet like Nathan to worship God in that tent or that house that you make. And then finally, another craft that is simple is to take some cards, either playing cards or... and when I was a kid, on rainy afternoons, I would take cards, and you can build what's called a house of cards. Well, it's hard to do on this surface, but you can kind of put the cards together like so, and if you do it just right, you can make them stand up, and maybe you can put a little roof. Oh, it fell apart. Might take a little practice, but you can do it, and with some practice, and make a house out of cards. And then you can make it big and wide, or you can make it tall, and just practice that and make a house of cards. So that's the story of the prophet Nathan and how he gave a wonderful message to David, and that David's son built a house for God. And think about how we worship God in our house of God today. So thank you for being part of this Bible story and learning about a prophet from God and learning about Nathan. And I will see you next week with another story about a prophet of God.